Grace Millane, the Tinder date that ended in murder. On the evening of December 1st, 2018, a young British backpacker walked through the busy streets of Auckland, New Zealand. She was 21 years old. She had spent months traveling across South America and Oceania. She was adventurous, optimistic, and excited about the future. That night, she was meeting a man she had recently connected with on Tinder. Hours later, she would vanish. For nearly a week, her family desperately searched for answers. Then detectives began reviewing thousands of hours of CCTV footage. What they discovered would shock an entire nation. This is the story of Grace Millane, a case that transformed a dream trip into a nightmare, and a murder investigation where cameras captured almost every step of the killer's actions. Grace Millane was born in Essex, England, in 1996. She was the youngest of 3 children and was known for her warm personality, creativity, and love of adventure. Friends described her as compassionate and thoughtful. Before leaving for her travels, she even donated her hair to the Little Princess Trust, helping children suffering from cancer. After graduating from the University of Lincoln with a degree in advertising and marketing, Grace decided to take a gap year before beginning her professional career. She had carefully saved money for the trip. It was meant to be the adventure of a lifetime. In October 2018, she left the United Kingdom and began exploring the world. She visited Peru and traveled across South America before eventually arriving in New Zealand. Throughout her journey, she regularly stayed in contact with family and friends. She constantly shared photos, stories, and updates. Her loved ones always knew where she was. That made what happened next even more alarming. On November 20th, Grace arrived in New Zealand. She spent several days exploring the country before reaching Auckland at the end of November. She checked into the base backpackers hostel on Queen Street, one of the city's busiest areas. On Saturday, December 1st, she made plans to meet someone, a man she had recently matched with on Tinder. His name was Jesse Kempson. At first, Grace seemed uncertain about meeting him, but after exchanging messages, she agreed to go for drinks. Shortly before 6 p.m., she left her hostel. Wearing a black dress and white trainers, she walked into the city centre. It would be the last time she was seen alive by anyone who truly cared about her. The couple met at Sky City, one of Auckland's most popular entertainment complexes. Security cameras captured them talking, laughing, and moving between bars. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal first date. At one point, Grace messaged a friend. She wrote, "I clicked so well with him." It sounded promising. Perhaps she had met someone special during her travels. But the man sitting across from her was hiding a very different reality. Jesse Kempson was 26 years old. He had built his life on lies. Former friends described him as a compulsive liar. He claimed to be successful. He claimed to be wealthy. He claimed to work prestigious jobs. Many of those claims were completely false. Over the years, he had repeatedly deceived employers, landlords, girlfriends, and even family members. He created fictional versions of himself and expected others to believe them. When those lies collapsed, he simply invented new ones. Grace knew none of this. As the evening continued, CCTV footage showed the pair moving through Auckland's nightlife district. At around 9:30 p.m., cameras captured them walking hand in hand. A few minutes later, they entered the City Life Hotel where Jesse was staying. They stepped into a lift together. The footage showed them reaching Jesse's floor. Then they disappeared into his room. Grace Millane was never seen leaving. The next day was Grace's 22nd birthday. Back home in England, messages began arriving from family and friends. Nobody received a reply. Hours passed. Then an entire day. Still nothing. For Grace, that was completely out of character. Her family became increasingly concerned. Her brother later explained that Grace always stayed in touch. Even while traveling, she regularly sent updates and photographs. Silence was unusual, and silence on her birthday was alarming. On December 5th, Grace was officially reported missing. Auckland police immediately began searching for answers. Detectives quickly discovered her final known movements through CCTV footage. That investigation soon led them to the last person seen with her, Jesse Kempson. When officers first spoke to him, he appeared calm. He admitted meeting Grace. He admitted spending the evening with her. But according to Jesse, they had parted ways around 10 p.m. He claimed Grace had simply walked away. He even suggested they had planned another date. If that were true, detectives reasoned, then someone else must have encountered Grace afterwards. But the cameras told a very different story. Investigators collected footage from across Auckland. The amount of video evidence was enormous. Nearly 6 terabytes of CCTV recordings were reviewed, and what they discovered completely destroyed Jesse's account. The cameras showed Grace entering the City Life Hotel with him, but they never showed her leaving, not once. Then investigators looked at Jesse's movements the following morning. What they found was deeply disturbing. Instead of searching for Grace, instead of contacting police, instead of showing concern, Jesse went shopping. He purchased a large suitcase. He bought cleaning products. He rented a car. Later that day, he met another woman for a Tinder date. The woman would later tell police that Jesse made strange comments about dead bodies and burial sites. His behavior made her uncomfortable. She never saw him again. Meanwhile, the cameras continued recording. That evening, Jesse was seen loading 2 large suitcases into the rental vehicle. The following morning, he purchased a shovel. Hours later, he used a pressure washer to clean the car. Every movement was documented. Every step. Every decision. Every attempt to conceal what had happened. Police now knew they were dealing with something far more serious than a missing person case. As evidence mounted, detectives interviewed Jesse again. This time, his story changed dramatically. He no longer claimed Grace had left. Instead, he admitted she had died inside his hotel room. But according to Jesse, it was an accident. He claimed they had engaged in consensual, rough sex. He said Grace had asked him to place pressure on her neck. He insisted he never intended to harm her. According to his version of events, he later fell asleep. When he woke up, she was dead. Panicked, he claimed he disposed of the body because he was frightened. But investigators had serious doubts. The physical evidence did not support his explanation. A forensic examination revealed signs of sustained strangulation. Experts testified that considerable force would have been required. The pressure had been maintained for several minutes, far longer than would be expected in an accidental situation. Even more damaging were Jesse's actions after Grace's death. Instead of calling emergency services, instead of seeking help, he searched the internet. He viewed pornography. He photographed Grace's body. He purchased cleaning supplies. He bought a suitcase. He transported her remains. And he buried her in a remote area. Those were not the actions of someone desperately trying to save a life. On December 9th, police located Grace's body in bushland near the Waitakere Ranges. She had been buried in a shallow grave. The search was over. The nightmare was real. News of the discovery devastated both New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Thousands followed the case. Many saw Grace as a daughter, a sister, or a friend, a young traveller whose trust had been cruelly betrayed. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern addressed the nation. Her words would become internationally known. She publicly apologised to Grace's family. She said Grace should have been safe in New Zealand, but she wasn't. The statement resonated across the world. As the murder trial approached, attention turned toward Jesse Kempson's defence. His legal team argued that Grace's death resulted from consensual sexual activity gone wrong. The defence insisted there had been no intention to kill. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They argued Jesse deliberately strangled Grace, then calmly spent the next 2 days covering his tracks. The jury listened to weeks of evidence. They reviewed CCTV footage. They examined forensic findings. They heard testimony from witnesses. Again and again, the evidence pointed in one direction. Jesse Kempson had lied repeatedly, and those lies became impossible to ignore. On December 22, 2019, the jury reached a verdict. After only a few hours of deliberation, Jesse Kempson was found guilty of murder. Grace's family finally heard the words they had waited a year to hear. Guilty. The judge sentenced Jesse to life imprisonment. He would serve a minimum of 17 years before becoming eligible for parole. But the story did not end there. Following the murder conviction, additional allegations emerged. Other women came forward. One former partner described violent abuse. Another British tourist accused Jesse of rape. In separate proceedings, he was convicted of additional offences involving violence against women. These revelations strengthened the belief that Grace's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a broader pattern of dangerous behaviour. For Grace's family, however, no sentence could ever repair what had been lost. A young woman with her entire future ahead of her was gone. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a traveller who simply wanted to explore the world. In the years since her death, Grace's legacy has continued through campaigns established in her name. The Love Grace initiative helps women escaping domestic abuse by providing essential items and support. Thousands of donations have been made. Countless lives have been touched. And while Grace's life was cruelly cut short, her memory continues to inspire kindness and compassion. The murder of Grace Millane remains one of the most shocking criminal cases in New Zealand's history, not only because of the crime itself, but because the investigation exposed the calculated actions of a killer who believed he could escape responsibility. Yet technology told the truth. CCTV cameras silently recorded what happened. The evidence spoke. The lies collapsed. And justice eventually prevailed. But for those who loved Grace Millane, one question remains impossible to answer. What would her life have become if she had never walked into that hotel room on the night of December 1st, 2018? That answer was stolen forever. The detectives now had a mountain of evidence, but one crucial question remained. What exactly had happened inside room 308 of the City Life Hotel? That answer would become the center of one of New Zealand's most closely watched murder trials. By the time Jesse Kempson appeared in court, public interest in the case had exploded. Every major news outlet was covering the investigation. The disappearance of a young British backpacker had already shocked the country. But as more details emerged, the case became even more disturbing. During the early stages of the investigation, the public did not know Jesse's identity. New Zealand courts granted him temporary name suppression to protect the integrity of future legal proceedings. As a result, news reports referred only to a 26-year-old Auckland man. Meanwhile, Grace's family continued living through every parent's worst nightmare. David Millane had travelled from England to New Zealand hoping to find his daughter alive. Instead, he was forced to identify her remains. The emotional toll was devastating. Many people who watched his press conference later said they would never forget it. Standing in front of cameras, visibly exhausted and heartbroken, he described Grace as a loving daughter who stayed in constant contact with her family. He thanked the public for their support. Yet behind his words was the growing reality that Grace would never come home. As preparations for trial began, forensic specialists continued examining every piece of evidence collected from Jesse's hotel room. What they found painted a grim picture. Investigators discovered traces of Grace's blood in several locations. Despite Jesse's efforts to clean the room, forensic techniques revealed evidence that could not be erased. The prosecution argued that Jesse's actions after Grace's death revealed his true state of mind. If her death had genuinely been an accident, they asked, why spend hours covering it up? Why buy a suitcase? Why hire a vehicle? Why purchase a shovel? Why bury her body? Why lie repeatedly to police? Those questions would become central to the trial. When proceedings finally began in November 2019, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the public gallery. The Millane family sat quietly, listening to details no family should ever have to hear. Throughout much of the trial, Jesse Kempson showed little emotion. Witness after witness described his behavior. Security staff, hotel employees, forensic experts, police detectives. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. Then came the prosecution's most powerful evidence, the CCTV footage. Jurors watched recordings showing Grace and Jesse entering the City Life Hotel together. They watched footage of Jesse buying a suitcase less than 12 hours later. They saw him renting a car. They saw him transporting heavy luggage. They saw him purchasing a shovel. Every movement seemed to contradict his claim of panic and confusion. The prosecution argued that these actions demonstrated planning, control, and awareness. This was not the behavior of a man overwhelmed by shock. It was the behavior of someone trying to avoid responsibility. Then the defense presented its case. Their argument focused on a controversial explanation. According to Jesse, Grace's death resulted from consensual sexual activity involving strangulation. The defense argued that both adults willingly participated. What happened, they claimed, was a tragic accident, nothing more. It was a strategy that immediately generated intense public debate. Many people were outraged. Women's rights groups argued that similar defenses had increasingly been used in cases involving violence against women. They feared that responsibility was being shifted away from offenders and placed onto victims. Inside the courtroom, however, emotions and opinions mattered far less than evidence. The jury's task was simple: determine whether the prosecution had proven murder beyond reasonable doubt. Medical experts soon became critical witnesses. The pathologist who conducted Grace's post-mortem examination explained the injuries found on her body: bruising around her neck, evidence of sustained pressure, signs consistent with forceful restraint. The expert testimony suggested that significant pressure had been applied for several minutes, not seconds, minutes. The prosecution argued that any reasonable person would have recognized the danger long before death occurred. The evidence, they said, supported murder, not an accident. Then another damaging detail emerged. Investigators recovered Jesse's internet searches from the night Grace died. The searches included information about remote locations, birds that consumed carcasses, and areas near where Grace's body would eventually be found. The timing was crucial. These searches occurred while Grace lay dead inside the hotel room. For prosecutors, the implication was clear. Jesse was already planning what to do next. As the trial entered its final stages, jurors heard about Jesse's repeated lies. He had lied during his first police interview. He had lied about when Grace left. He had lied about his movements. He had lied about his activities after her death. Again and again, his story changed whenever new evidence appeared. The prosecution described it as a maze of deception, a web of lies designed to conceal the truth. When closing arguments concluded, the jury retired to deliberate. The entire country waited. News channels provided constant updates. Legal experts debated possible outcomes. Grace's family prepared themselves for whatever verdict might come. After approximately 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent. Jesse Kempson stood in the dock. The foreperson rose. The verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of murder. For the Millane family, it was a moment of mixed emotions. There was relief. Justice had been served. But there was also sorrow. No verdict could bring Grace back. No sentence could undo what had happened. Months later, during sentencing, the judge described Jesse as a physically powerful man who had completely dominated a vulnerable young woman. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. He would serve a minimum of 17 years before becoming eligible for parole. For many, the case seemed finished, but more revelations were still to come. After restrictions on reporting were lifted, additional allegations involving Jesse became public. 2 separate criminal cases emerged. The details shocked even experienced investigators. One former partner described years of abuse. She told the court that Jesse had strangled her, threatened her, controlled her finances, and subjected her to repeated violence. In another case, a British tourist described being raped by Jesse after meeting him through Tinder. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Again and again, women described manipulation, intimidation, and violence. The image Jesse had carefully constructed for strangers was completely different from the reality described in courtrooms. Many investigators later believed that Grace was not simply unlucky. She encountered a dangerous predator, someone who had spent years hiding behind lies. The tragedy also triggered broader conversations throughout New Zealand and beyond. Many people questioned whether so-called rough sex defenses should continue being accepted in murder trials. Campaigners argued that such arguments often risked blaming victims instead of focusing on offenders. The debate eventually influenced legal discussions in several countries. Meanwhile, Grace's family worked to ensure her memory would not be defined solely by the circumstances of her death. They created the Love Grace campaign. The initiative collects handbags filled with essential items for women fleeing domestic abuse shelters. The idea came from a simple observation. Women escaping violent relationships often leave with almost nothing. A handbag containing toiletries, clothing, and personal items can provide dignity during a terrifying moment. What began as a tribute to Grace soon spread internationally. Thousands of bags have been donated. Thousands of women have received support. In death, Grace continued helping others. There was another tragedy, however. In November 2020, Grace's father, David Millane, died after battling cancer. Many people remembered his courage during the investigation, his determination to find his daughter, his dignity in the face of unimaginable grief. He never stopped speaking about Grace. He never stopped fighting for her memory. Today, the murder of Grace Millane remains one of the most significant criminal cases in modern New Zealand history. Not simply because a young tourist was killed, but because the investigation demonstrated how modern technology can expose even carefully planned deception. Nearly every lie Jesse Kempson told was disproved by evidence. A camera, a receipt, a search history. a witness, a timeline. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. And while justice was ultimately delivered, the case leaves behind a haunting reminder. Grace Millane travelled to New Zealand seeking adventure. She trusted someone she had only recently met. A decision millions of people make every day. Most return safely. Grace never did. And for that reason, her story continues to resonate around the world, not as a story about fear, but as a story about truth. Because despite every lie, every excuse, and every attempt to hide what happened, the evidence never stopped speaking. And in the end, it spoke for Grace. As the years passed, the case continued to leave a deep mark on New Zealand society. For many people, Grace Millane became more than a victim in a criminal trial. She became a symbol of trust betrayed, a symbol of how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into tragedy, and a symbol of why violence against women continues to demand attention. The impact of the case could be seen everywhere. Schools discussed personal safety. Universities organized awareness events. Domestic violence organizations reported increased public engagement. People who had never met Grace felt connected to her story because they recognized something familiar. She could have been their daughter, their sister, their friend, their traveling companion. That emotional connection was one of the reasons the case attracted worldwide attention. Unlike many murder investigations, there was no organized criminal network, no gang involvement, no complex conspiracy. Instead, there was a young woman enjoying the trip of a lifetime, and a man she believed she could trust. That simplicity made the tragedy even more disturbing. For detectives who worked the case, the investigation remained unforgettable. Detective Inspector Scott Beard later described the enormous effort involved in piecing together Grace's final movements. Hundreds of officers participated in the investigation. Thousands of hours were spent reviewing evidence. The CCTV footage alone created an almost complete timeline. Investigators were able to follow Jesse's movements minute by minute. They watched him move through the city. They watched him make purchases. They watched him transport evidence. In many murder cases, detectives spend months trying to establish a timeline. In this case, technology provided one almost immediately. But despite the strength of the evidence, the emotional burden remained heavy. Many officers had daughters close to Grace's age. Many had followed her family's public appeals. Finding her body was not a moment of celebration. It was confirmation that their worst fears had become reality. Years later, some investigators would still describe the case as one of the most emotionally difficult of their careers. For Grace's family, however, the pain never truly ended. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family gathering, there was an empty chair, an empty space, a future that had been stolen. Her brothers often spoke about the small moments they missed most, the conversations that would never happen, the milestones they would never share, the children Grace would never have, the life she never got the chance to live. Yet despite their grief, they chose to focus on Grace's legacy rather than the man who killed her. That decision transformed public perception of the case. Instead of allowing Jesse Kempson to dominate the narrative, they redirected attention toward helping others. The Love Grace campaign continued to grow. What began as a small tribute became an international movement. Communities across the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and other countries organized collection drives. Thousands of handbags were donated. Inside each bag were practical items: toothbrushes, shampoo, sanitary products, warm clothing, small comforts that many people take for granted. For women escaping abuse, those simple items could make a tremendous difference. The campaign reflected who Grace had been: kind, compassionate, generous. Even after her death, those qualities continued to touch lives. Meanwhile, Jesse Kempson remained behind bars. He filed appeals. He challenged aspects of his convictions. But the murder verdict stood. The evidence remained overwhelming. The CCTV footage, the forensic findings, the internet searches, the lies. Together, they created a picture that jurors found impossible to ignore. One of the most chilling aspects of the case remains the contrast between appearance and reality. On the surface, Jesse appeared ordinary. He was not a stranger lurking in a dark alley. He was not someone who immediately raised alarm bells. He presented himself as successful, confident, professional. That ability to create a convincing facade allowed him to gain trust. It also serves as a reminder that dangerous individuals rarely look dangerous. Often, they appear completely normal. That lesson has resonated with millions of people who followed the case. The murder of Grace Millane also changed public conversations about dating applications. While millions safely use platforms such as Tinder every day, the case highlighted the importance of caution when meeting strangers. Many safety campaigns emerged following the trial: advice about meeting in public places, sharing locations with friends, checking in regularly, simple precautions that may help reduce risk. Yet it is important to remember one thing. Responsibility for Grace's murder belongs solely to the man who killed her, not to Grace, not to her choices, not to her decision to go on a date. That distinction became a major theme throughout public discussions following the trial. Many people rejected attempts to scrutinize Grace's personal life. Instead, they focused on the actions of the offender. As one campaigner later observed, the question was never why Grace trusted someone. The question was why Jesse abused that trust. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate years later. At its heart, it is not simply a murder story. It is a story about vulnerability, about deception, about accountability, and about the extraordinary determination of investigators who refused to stop searching for the truth. On December 1st, 2018, Grace Millane walked through Auckland expecting an ordinary evening. She could not have known she was entering the final hours of her life. But because of the relentless efforts of detectives, forensic experts, prosecutors, and witnesses, her voice was not silenced. The evidence spoke for her. The truth emerged, and justice was delivered. Yet when people remember Grace Millane today, they rarely remember the courtroom. They rarely remember the legal arguments. Instead, they remember the smiling young traveller whose photographs captured the excitement of seeing the world. A daughter who loved her family. A friend who inspired loyalty. A young woman who wanted to experience life. That is the person her family wants the world to remember. Not the tragedy, not the violence, but Grace herself. Because while one man took her future away, he could never erase the impact she had on those who loved her. And in that sense, Grace Millane's story did not end in a courtroom. It continues every time someone donates a handbag through the Love Grace campaign. Every time a survivor receives support. Every time her name inspires compassion rather than fear. And every time people choose to remember the victim rather than the killer. More than 7 years after her death, Grace Millane remains remembered not for how she died, but for who she was. And perhaps that is the most powerful form of justice of all.